On my way.
Engine 9, Rescue 209. Respond for an unknown medical. RP says that she saw a subject suddenly fall to the ground.
On our way. On our way. Yeah, on my way. On our way. On my way.
Yeah?
On our way. What's up? On our way. On our way. Listening. I'm on it. Yeah? On my way. Yeah, on my way. Yeah? Let's go. What's up? On my way. Will be done immediately. On our way.
Engine 57, Rescue 64. Respond for 1056A. Subject is threatening to take his own life. PD is also responding.
On my way. On my way. What's up? On my way. Will be done immediately. On our way. On our way. Yeah? Yeah? On our way. Consider it done. Listening. Yeah? On our way.
Attention all units, respond for 415 large group which is gathering in front of a business. The RP is the business owner and he is requesting that the subjects be removed. Also be advised that according to the RP the situation appears to be escalating.
On my way. On my way.
Resist!
On my way.
Yeah, on my way. Got it.
Resist!
On my way. What's up? Got it.
Resist!
Yeah, will be done immediately.
On my way. Listening. On our way. Will be done immediately. On my way. On my way. What's up? On my way.
Resist! Resist!
On my way.
Listening. On my way.
Resist!
On our way. On my way. On my way. Yeah. On my way. Got it. On our way. Listening. On my way. Listening.
Resist! Resist!
On our way. On my way. What's up? On my way. On my way.
Resist! Resist!
On my way.
Resist! Resist!
On our way.
Resist!
On my way.
Resist!
On our way.
Resist!
What's up? On my way.
Resist! 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 Resist!
Yeah? On my way.
Resist!
On my way. Yeah?
Resist!
On my way.
Resist!
On my way.
Resist! Resist!
On our way.
What's up? On my way.
Resist! Resist!
On our way. On our way.
What's up? Yeah? Will be done immediately.
On our way. Consider it done. On our way. Consider it done. Yeah? On our way.
Resist!
Listening. Listening. On our way. Yeah? What's up? Will do. Yeah? On my way. Consider it done. What's up?
Resist!
What's up? On my way. On my way. On my way. On our way.
Resist!
Listening. Understood. Listening. On our way. Consider it done. What's up? Consider it done. On my way. Yeah? On our way. On my way. What's up? On our way. No problem. Will do. What's up? On my way. Listening. On our way. Consider it done. On my way. Yeah, on our way. Yeah, on my way. Yeah, on my way. On my way. Yeah. Understood. On our way. On the way. Listening. Consider it done. On the way. Listening. No problem. On the way. Listening. On the way. On our way. Yeah, confirming. On the way.
Resist! Resist!
Listening. On my way. Roger.
Resist!
Yeah?
Resist! 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 Resist!
Yeah? Roger. On our way.
Resist!
What's up? Yes.
Resist!
On my way. Immediately. On our way. Yes. On my way. Roger.
Resist! Resist!
Yeah? On my way.
Resist!
Immediately. Listening. On my way.
Resist!
Yeah? On my way.
Resist! Resist!
Roger.
Resist!
On my way. Listening. On our way. On my way.
Resist!
On my way. Listening. On our way. Yeah?
Resist! Resist! Resist!
Yeah? On my way. Listening. On our way. Will do. Listening. Will do. Yeah? Will do. Listening. Will do. What's up? Roger. What's up? On the way. What's up? Yeah? On our way. Immediately. Listening. On our way. On our way. What's up? Will do. Yeah, will do. I'm on it. Yeah, on our way. Will be done immediately. Consider it done. What's up? Will do. On the way. Okay. Listening. Okay. On the way. Consider it done. Yeah, will do. Yeah. Okay. What's up? On my way. Yeah, on our way. Let's go. On my way. Roger. Yeah. On our way. Listening. On my way. Let's go. What's up? On our way. Let's go! What's up? Yeah? Let's go! Yeah? On our way.
Yeah?
Okay.
Listening. I'm on it.
What's up? On my way. What's up? On my way. Immediately. Yeah? On my way. Listening. On my way. What's up? Confirming. Listening. I'm on it. Got it. On our way. Yes, sir. Listening. Consider it done. Will do. Listening. On my way. I'm on it. Yeah, will do. On our way. Yeah, on our way. On my way. I'm on it. Yeah. Confirming. Yeah, on our way. On my way. What's up? On my way. On my way. Yeah, on my way. On our way. What's up? Listening. On our way. Listening. Immediately. On my way. Listening. Yeah? On our way. Okay. Listening. Will do. What's on up? My way. On our way. On my way. our way. Listening. On my way. On my way. On my way. What's up? On our way. On our way. Let's go. On our way. Got it.
Yeah? On my way.
Listening. On my way. On our way. Yes, sir. On our way. What's up?
Roger. Okay. Yeah? On our way.
What's up? Will do. On my way. Consider it done. On my way. On our way. Got it. On our way. On my way. Listening. On my way. On our way. Listening. On our way. I'm on it. Yes, sir.
Roger. Okay. What's up? On my way.
On our way. Got it.
Yeah?
Will be done immediately. On my way. On my way. Okay.
Listening, consider it
I'm
done.
on it. On my way.
our way.
Listening. On our way.
On my
Listening.
way. Be done immediately.
On my way.
What's up? On my way.
On my way.
Immediately. What's
On
up?
our way.
We'll be done immediately.
On my way. On my way.
What's up?
On our way. Listening. Will do. Yeah. Okay. On my way.
Yes. Okay. What's up? On my way.
Listening. On my way. Let's go. Listening.
On our way.
On my way.
What's up?
That's okay. What's up? On our way. Will do. On our way.
What's up?
Yeah? On our way.
On my way. Listening. Okay. On my way.
Yes. Okay. On my way.
Listening. On my way. Let's go. On my way.
What's
On
up?
my way. On my way.
Listening. On my way.
On our way. Will do. What's up? On my way. On my way. On my way.
What's up? On our way.
Immediately. Listening. I'm on it.
On my way.
Listening. On my way. Listening.
On my way.
Yeah? Listening. Yes, sir.
On our way. Immediately.
I'm on it. Listening. On our way. Listening. I'm on it. On my way.
Yeah? On our way.
On our way. Yeah? Yeah, will do.
What's up? On my way. Listening.
What's up? On our way.
Roger. Immediately.
On the way. On my way. Yeah? On my way. Yeah, will do. Listening.
On our way. On our way.
On my way. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, on my way. Yeah?
On my way. What's up? On my way. On our way.
Listening. Listening. On my way. Yeah?
On our way.
What's on our way? Listening. What's up? On our way. On the way.
What's up? Listening.
Listening. On the way. On our way.
What's up? Listen immediately.
Yeah? Yeah? On the way.
Yeah? Yeah?
What's up? On our way. On the way.
Listening.
Yeah? Listening. On the way. On the way.
Listening.
Yeah? On the way. On our way.
What's up?
Will be done immediately. On the way. On our way. Yeah? On the way. Listening. On the way. On our way.
Listening.
What's up? Listening. On our way.
Yeah?
On our way.
Listening. Will be done immediately.
On our way. On the way.
Listening.
On the way. What's up? On our way.
What's up?
On the way. Listening. On the way.
What's up? On our way.
On our way.
What's up?
Listening. On the way. What's up? Will be done immediately. On our way.
What's up?
Yeah? On the way. On the way. On the way.
What's up?
What's up? On the way. On the way.
What's up?
What's up? On the way.
Rescue 264. Respond for an unknown medical, possible food poisoning. RP is calling from the market. She's indicating that her friend had eaten at a nearby restaurant and suddenly became ill.
On my way. On our way.
Yeah? I'm on it. What's up?
Yeah, on my way. On our way.
Yeah?
I'm on it.
We'll be done immediately.
Resist. Resist.
Attention all units,
Resist.
respond for a
Resist.
415 large group which is gathering in front of a business. The RP is the business owner and he is requesting that the subjects be removed. Also be advised that according to the RP, the situation appears to be escalating.
Resist. Resist. Resist.
Listening, we'll be done immediately.
Resist.
Engine 9, Engine 77, Engine 78, Truck 64, Battalion 209. Respond for a structure fire possibly caused by an electrical appliance. Be advised there are injuries.
On my way. On our way. On my way.
What's up? On my way. Let's go. On our way. Listening.
On my way.
Yeah? Yes, sir. On our way. On our way.
On my way. On our way. On our way.
What's on our way. Okay. Consider it done. On my way. We'll be done immediately.
On my way.
Consider it done. Listening. On our way. On our way. Immediately. On our way.
Yeah? Yeah? On my way. On my way. Let's go. Let's go.
On my way.
Yeah? On our way.
What's up? On our way. Let's go.
On my way. On my way. Yeah. Understood. On our way. Listening. On my way. On my way. What's up? On my way. Listening. Consider it done. On my way. What's up? On our way. Immediately. On my way. On my way. Listening. On my way.
Consider it done.
On my way. What's up? On our way. Let's go. Yeah, on my way. What's up? Yeah, will be done immediately. What's up? On my way. Will do. On my way.
What's up? On our way.
On our way. Yeah? On my way. What's up? Listening. On my way. Let's go. On my way.
Yeah? On our way. We'll be done immediately.
Yeah? On our way. Yeah? On my way. Listening. On my way. Listening. On our way. Yeah, on our way. Consider it done. What's up? Consider it done. On our way. What's up? On our way. Yeah? Yeah? Yeah?
Engine
On my
11,
way.
Rescue 12. Respond for